very grateful actually that this meeting is taking place in December because this feels like Christmas to me today. It's a wonderful, exciting opportunity. I'm going to spend the majority of my presentation just trying to really set the framework for the rest of the conversations that we're having today and throughout the entire summit. And it really is suggesting that there might be a new way to be thinking about the issues that are facing orphan and vulnerable children, and to take a little bit from the U.S. experience about how we might do that. So, just start with this basic statement, which is the only rock that I know, the only one that stays steady, the only institution I know that works is the family. And I love to start with this particular quote because for all of us who know Lee Iacocca, he was a business person, so he understood, I think, the economic impact more than most about having a strong society in both its very basic units in the family. And so the first point I wanted to make this morning is that if we want to have these conversations, particularly at the government level, it's best to start by recognizing that the family is the basic unit of a civilized society, and that if we can build strong families and we can preserve and strengthen them, then we can also build strong nations. I think we could look throughout history, and it's actually rife with the opposite example where we've tried to do in the reverse order by starting at the governmental or the institutional level and didn't build it on the solid foundation that we've been talking about this morning, and in essence it doesn't work. And so trying to reframe our conversations to be based on that principle. In order to do that, I think what we have to be able to do is to have any program that we're working to establish to both recognize and preserve the role of a family to a child. And what I wanted to give two examples. A lot of my experience is actually more in the domestic front, and I wanted to give examples of where the U.S. government has done that well and where they have done it not so well. For those of us who have worked in the domestic front, a very important, very critical program is the Women, Infants, and Children program. And for those of us who are familiar with it, what it is an attempt to ensure that children of a very young age and women who are pregnant receive good nutritional support. And the whole program is designed actually for children in utero and children under the age of 3 to be able to receive those services through their mothers. And so the program is meeting the need of the child, but they're doing it through the parent. I'll give the opposite example as a program that is called the Independent Living Program. It is something that serves youth in foster care once they're age 16. And the idea is that they are children who have been identified by our foster care system as being unlikely to re-enter some sort of family setting. And so the idea is you need to be sure that they get all the skills that they're going to need in order to transition into adult life. And a lot of these are different skill levels. And this is not actually done in a family. It's most often done in a classroom setting through different training manuals. And one of the conversations that we just had last week at the U.S. government level is it's not surprising we're having tremendously bad outcomes for the 29,000 children that are aging out of foster care. They are more than likely to be homeless, more than likely to be involved in drugs, and more than there appears to be a parent themselves before they're even adults themselves. So I think it's an example of trying to show the difference of two programs, both aiming to serve the needs of children, but doing so, one in the first example, doing it with the family at the center, and the second, thinking that we can replace the role that a parent otherwise would play through a service. So in order to switch our approach, what we have to do is to figure out what does a family provide to a child. And I won't belabor the point and go over all the different things that have been suggested here this morning. But one of the dangers, I think, if you don't look at this as being a full continuum of things that a family is able to provide a child, and to suggest that one or any of these is any more important than the other, then I think that's where we can fall victim to some of the mistakes that we are trying not to make here today. Every one of these different things that a family is able to provide, or a parent to provide to a child, is equally important. Some may be more critical in terms of their timing. They might need to be taken in some sort of priority order, but it's not any sense of priority in terms of overall the child receiving them. I think the other thing that we have to be careful of as we talk about designing systems and interventions is to make sure that we have thoughtful conversations about what types of services can be provided in an, and I forget the word, institutional setting, so things that can be provided en masse to children as a group, versus what are the types of things that are simply impossible to be provided from an institution. It's very, very difficult for a government or a program to love a child. And so these are the types of things that we would want to suggest. Why should the U.S. government focus on children who are outside of family care? As has been suggested in many of the conversations, if you look at the larger circles and you see how they continue to intersect in that very center, we find that the children who are outside of family care, although members of the larger groups, are also in that center, and some have suggested perhaps the most vulnerable of the larger circles. And so if you can get at the most vulnerable first, those who, in addition to need protection, being affected by war or disaster, and lacking access to basic human needs, are also in a situation where they're outside of family care, you can address both needs at the same time. So why is it uniquely difficult to serve children who are outside of family care? A lot of the discussions up until this point, and I think ones that will be had throughout the day, is, as I just suggested, they're thought to be the most vulnerable because they don't have pretty much anyone in this world who's making sure that they're getting their basic needs met. As we've heard this morning, a lot of their overall cognitive and emotional and development needs are also not being met. So with the passing of time, they're becoming more and more likely to be at risk. We're lacking, as Susan just said, we're lacking critical information about them. And what's challenging for those of us who are trying to get that information is the ways that you tend to a system that is much more complex. And so sometimes it can make that harder. It's also something that is a long-term commitment because you have to make sure that once the intervention is in place, that it is something that is secure. So these are some of the challenges. And I think the final point is we lack the research to validate the common understanding of the impact that a parent has on a child. We know many, many things about the relationship, and it's been suggested we know more today than we've known in the past, but we still don't know the nuances, if you will, that would allow us to make sure that the interventions are, in fact, meeting that child's need for the love and nurturing that goes into their development. So I wanted to just quickly give an example of why it is a very important time for us to be hosting this particular convening today. We are beginning, I think, as an international community to both recognize and celebrate a child's basic human right to a family. And so if you look at a lot of the policy making that's been taking place around the world, it's very, very exciting. It's not only recognizing that the child has this right, but in setting out different efforts to sustain that right through laws, policies, and programs. But what continues to come up in so many of these conversations are the definitions of critical terms. All day today we've been using terms like family, we've been talking about the role of a parent, and when you're talking about policy, those conversations have one meaning. When you're talking about it from a scientific perspective, they have a very different meaning. And sometimes some of the debate, some of the lack of agreement comes because we are answering the questions as individuals that are policymakers and not having the evidence to the research and scientific evidence to support those beliefs. So, for instance, critical questions like what makes an institution an institution? Is it the number of children that are cared for? Is it the type of care that they receive? Is it the relationship of the caretaker to the child? Is it the amount of hours? Is it the child to caregiver ratio? These are questions that we don't fully understand the answers to yet, and understanding them will be a necessary basis, if you will, for good policy making. At this point in the presentation, I always make the example of my own life. I have 3 children under the age of 7, and I spend 72 hours a week with them. That's less than, for all of us, that's 168 hours in a week, and I spend about half of them with my children. And yet, it's very interesting that they've never been confused as to the role that I have in their life, and hopefully to God, they're developing normally. And so it doesn't affect the relationship that they have. I have a nanny in my home. She seems to be providing all the different things that they need for, so it's not necessarily that she's paid to do it, it's the consistency. I mean, these are the types of questions that I think we're looking for science to provide the answers to. And once those answers are available, then I would suggest that we use them in order to guide good policy. I'd like to kind of leave with a call to action, if you will, and suggest that maybe if we're going into an area of a new thinking and a shift in the paradigm, that one of the examples that we use, particularly when we're hoping to use science as the basis, is the example of the establishment of antibiotics and the role that they've played in fighting off bacterial infections in our country over time. In 1926, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin while, and for those of you who think that this is bold, I'm in a room full of doctors, so I'm going to explain science, but anyway, that they were studying fungus. And so one of the things I find so interesting about it is that there are over 100 kinds of antibiotic, and what has developed is a system by which trained professionals go in and assess the type of infection that an individual patient is having, and then they use their knowledge that has been derived over time in order to prescribe what is the most appropriate form of antibiotic for that patient. And that is an ever-evolving process. It is not something that, you know, we just say, oh, well, we found one and we're good to go. In fact, there is research ongoing today to make sure that if we have a different strain of a different bacteria, hopefully we're prepared with the type of information that we would need in order to develop a new response. And I think that that's absolutely the type of approach we need to talk about when we're talking about providing families for children, because there really isn't one mode. There's no prescription. There's no one thing that drives that child to be in that circumstance. And so I think, like doctors who go and ask all the appropriate questions to determine what in fact would be the best treatment, we have to drive ourselves to have those systems in place, but also to have that thought process to say, you know, how can we do those things? I just want to end with two final points. One, because my staff will kill me if I don't. The CCAI was very proud to have sponsored in this last year a program called the Way Forward Project. And for those of you who were unable to participate in any part of the sessions, I really do invite you to go to the website and see the work that was done there. But the idea was to say that if we recognize this universal concept that children are best raised in families, how do we then start to take that very hard road to going from acknowledging that principle and moving it into actual practice? What are the things that have to take place? And we chose to focus on 6 countries in Africa where we felt like there was a lot of energy, a lot of excitement, a great amount of need at the governmental level, and figure out how could you start to transform those processes in the way that I've just discussed today. And I think at the very center of so many of those conversations were the questions that we're hoping to begin answering here today. A lot of what we knew was based on our own human instinct and less on what we knew to be founded in science. And so I'm so excited about something like this today, because I think what it's going to allow us to do is for us to open up our minds and be able to align the interventions that are appropriate. And I just, like I said, 2 last points. One thing that we have found, again, through the U.S. experience, I started by saying that that's where my background is that that children in and of themselves recognize that they have this right. And the U.S. government spends about $25 billion actually on our child welfare system out of our children who are outside of care. And I'm not a day goes by that I'm working with our foster youth where they don't remind me that what they really, really need. And we're a very wonderfully blessed country, and we're able to, thank God, provide so many of their basic needs, things like access to an education or health care and other things. But what we have not been able to provide them is that sense of belonging to a family. And so many of these young people will come up to me, and they have everything in the world. They are truly, I mean, they're in college, and they're doing great from those perspectives, but they'll say, I'm still lost. I'm still out here in a world where everyone else seems to connect with somebody, and I am basically out here on my own. And they want more than anything to belong. And I don't think that's just true in the U.S. experience. One of the things that I was able to do as part of the pre-groups was to read a study on children affected by the war in Liberia. And it was a very interesting study in which they talked to so many of the former combatants about the different types of services that they had received. And in receiving those services, they asked why, particularly the economic development, the job assistance programs that they had received. And almost across the board, the young people responded because it allowed them to belong and to be somebody in their community and give them this sense of importance and connectedness. And so it's interesting, it had nothing to do with the actual wages. And so I just really am excited to be a part of today and hope we can use these as some of the models for